Okay. Without further ado, it's best if I kind of talk from now on as little as possible and let the panel talk as much as possible. So I'll introduce them in the order they're going to speak. Just a brief word on the format. Everyone's going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, which we're going to observe pretty strictly because we're on a time limit here at CCT. I have these cards, yellow, which will be flashed at the speaker when they're a minute from time, and red for when they're going to get the staring of a lifetime if they don't finish quite soon. Keen-eyed observers will see that they actually come from an old pack of top trumps, but that's you have to make do. So what will happen then? Everybody will speak, but they'll give their 5 or 7 minute address or speech. We'll discuss points arising between ourselves here at the on the panel, and then it'll go out to you to ask any questions. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a point or an observation or anything, or a criticism. They're allowed to. Basically, we want to hear from you, anything that you have to say. We'll take a number of questions, and then the panel will answer, and we'll do that until our hour and a bit is up. So, okay. Brian McNamee, to my right, will speak first. He's a lecturer and researcher at the School of Computer Science and Informatics at UCD, and a principal investigator at Ireland's Centre for Applied Data Analytics Research, which is known as CEADAR. CEADAR. I had to get the pronunciation correct before announcing it. His research interests focus on the development of data analytics techniques for real-world problems. He's published extensively on data analytics and is Director of Education at the Analytics Store. That's correct, yeah? Yeah. Which is an analytics consultancy and training company. Next to speak up is Oisin Boydell, a senior researcher at CEDAR as well, with a slightly different emphasis to his research interests. He focuses mainly on data mining, machine learning, and insights from massive data sets. So both those areas of interest are of great interest to us here as well, and they'll have a great bearing on the discussion that we're going to have. Oisin has a PhD in computer science, and he has also got hands-on experience working with big data analytics in the telecoms industry. To my left, and last to speak, Martin Parks is a management consultant who helps business innovation by advising them on how to develop their internal communications and knowledge networks. His clients include Rolls-Royce at HSBC. He's written widely on design, technology and innovation for The Independent, for Spiked, The Guardian and Big Issue. And he's also co-author and founder of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. Okay, that's our panel. I'm going to hand it over to you, Brian. Kick us off.
Great. So thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to come here. So I suppose because I get to go first, I get to ask the question about what do we mean by big data. And I think the first interesting thing about that is that the technologists amongst us have to kind of hold our hands up and say that we lost the battle about what big data means. So when the term big data kind of first started to emerge, it had quite a technical definition, and people would talk about really big data were data sets that started to stretch data analysis software in terms of having excessive, people talked about volume, velocity and variety, which people might have heard of the 3 V's of big data. And that was around there for a while, but I think as the term started to creep in to the kind of more mass media, so in newspaper articles and on news reports and things like that, basically when people think about big data now, that's not the definition they have in their minds. So I think we have to give up and say, technology, we've lost that one. So I think the best way to think about big data is really any effort to collect, analyze and use digital data in order to make decisions. So that's when I think about big data, that's what I think that big data is. I suppose that's the starting point for kind of talking about what I'm going to talk about here. The other interesting thing, I suppose, is there's nothing new in this. So people have been collecting and analysing data for hundreds of years now. But I think there are a couple of things that are kind of new and interesting about what we're doing now. And most of those come from the fact that it's so much easier to collect data now than it has been ever before. So all the things that we do online now, so we live so much of our lives online, which means all that leaves a nice, easy to collect and easy to analyse digital footprint. The world is also full of cheap, easy to make sensors that record constant streams of data. So a good example is always the phones that we all carry around in our pockets. So they're just recording a constant stream of where you are, what you're doing, and who's around you. And all of that is just incredibly easy to collect and analyse now. And the key thing about that, I guess, is if we're going to collect and analyse that data, what's interesting about that is that helps us to make decisions and helps us to make data-driven decisions in particular. And I suppose one angle in that I'm particularly interested in is when those decisions are automated. So there's so many automated data-driven decisions that kind of creep into different parts of our lives. Some examples of those are kind of pretty expected things that we're quite used to. So if you log on to Amazon, those recommendations that you get on Amazon about the books that you might like, they're the output of an automated system that looks at the purchases you've made, looks at people who are similar to you, and figures out some nice recommendations to make. The spam detectors we have in our email systems, nice automated data-driven system there that learns the characteristics of spam emails and genuine emails. So we're all quite used to that, and that's kind of fine. But more and more, this kind of more interesting, more unexpected, and I guess in some ways kind of little unnerving areas that data-driven and automated data-driven decisions are moving into. So if you apply for a loan, there's an automated system that looks at your characteristics and issues a recommendation to say whether you should get that loan or not, based on the history of who's paid back loans and who hasn't. If you apply for a job as a stacking shelves in one of the big international retail chains, there's a good chance that the decision to give you that job or not isn't down to the chat that you have in the interview room, but there's an automated model that looks at your characteristics and figures out whether you're going to be a match and a good, reliable employee in that company. One of the ones that's especially interesting is in a number of the states in the US now, judges use automated data-driven systems when they're making decisions about parole. So basically the characteristics of the prisoners fed into the system. The system issues a recommendation on whether that prisoner is likely to reoffend in the future based on the historical data that's there, and the judge uses that input in his decision. So there's some pretty interesting things about where the data is, or where data-driven systems are kind of creeping into. And then I suppose from people who know a little bit what goes on kind of under the covers of that, what goes on behind, it can get a little bit unnerving because although we have kind of interesting, sophisticated techniques, most of this just boils down to chasing correlations. So we're basically looking at data sets to find patterns of things that imply other things. So basically this this characteristic in a prisoner implies that this prisoner is likely to reoffend or not reoffend. And one of the downsides to that is sometimes correlation isn't enough to drive good decisions, and these systems make mistakes. So an example that I like in this is about every month, LinkedIn sends me an automated email to say, here's some groups that we think you should join, Brian. And most of the time they include Irish women in big data. And I always get Irish women in big data, and the reason I always get Irish women in big data is that my characteristics correlate really, really well with the members of Irish women in big data. So I'm a computer scientist, I'm interested in big data, and I live in Ireland. I'm not a woman, but the system doesn't really notice that, so the system is looking for a strong correlation. 3 out of 4, that's not too bad. So the system says, this is a good group for you, and it doesn't have the subtlety or the nuance to realize that there's something important here that's missing. And there's loads of examples of similar kind of system breakdowns where, because these systems are just really chasing correlations, they make kind of bad recommendations. And so that kind of worries us a little bit, but I think an interesting kind of counterpoint to that is that when we look at the decisions that we make, a lot of the time we're not that good either. So I suppose like lots of other people, I read this good book, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It was kind of a big book in the last couple of years, and it has a long list of just really, really good examples of how bad we are at making decisions and how we're not as rational and as kind of well guided as we think we are. And he has a nice example in that of a study that they did, a kind of little experiment, back to judges again, where they got judges to roll a dice before those judges went in to make sentencing decisions. And unbeknownst to the judges, the dices were loaded, so some judges always got low numbers when they rolled their dice, some judges always got high numbers. And when they looked at the data they collected, The judges who always got high numbers gave long sentences. The judges who got low numbers gave low sentences. And the implication from that and the thing, there's a whole load of really nice examples of similar things, is that I suppose subconsciously to ourselves, we carry around and we collect all these biases in our minds that we use to make decisions. And that means we make an awful lot of bad decisions. And I think that the upshot of that for me is if we're going to kind of criticize automated data-driven decisions, we've got to think about, maybe we're not so good at that. So coming from all of that, what I think is that this kind of big data world that we live in, the collection, the analysis of that data, that's not really a tap that we can turn off anymore. That's kind of going to continue on. And I think a couple of really interesting questions that we can ask about that are, I think one is, are there lines around the decisions that we're happy to automate or not automate? So that spam detection is a good example. There's a nice trade-off there. So we set up this automated system to detect spam in our email. That saves us a lot of time. We don't get our email boxes full up with invitations to buy Viagra. But the risk that we're trading off there is we're going to miss those great emails. So that great job offer is going to end up in your spam email box and you're not going to see it. But because that saves us so much time and because that risk isn't that bad, we're happy to give over those decisions. When you get into the judges making sentencing decisions, I would start to wonder a little bit about that. Saying, is that really where we want to go? Are we happy to give over those? So I think that's a really interesting thing to say, where are those lines? I think a second really interesting question is, there's a sweet spot of that kind of lovely mix between people making decisions and data-driven decisions. The downside to that is in a lot of cases, we're not brilliant at bringing data into our decision making. So how do we make that work better? How do we bring people and data together to that kind of best of both worlds? And then I think the last question that I think is interesting in this is, how do we kind of maintain fairness in this area of big data? So going back to the point that these automated data-driven systems, they're all about finding correlations and finding patterns between this implies this and this implies that. The downside to that is outliers kind of get left around the edges. So people who don't match the patterns that are in the data get kind of left out of those decisions. And how do we figure that out? The way the systems work, that's just how they work. They're looking for nice, big, well-found examples inside the data. So if things are a little bit outside those, how do we look after those things? So they're kind of questions that I think are pretty interesting for us to talk about today. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Brian. Excellent timekeeping as well. A lot to discuss there. So great material to kick us off with. Oisin, I'll hand over to you.
Well, big data and the increasing role of data-driven decision making in all of our lives, it often raises suspicion and mistrust. On the one hand, though, there's huge societal benefits in areas such as medicine and health, improved public services and efficiencies that benefit us all. And no one can really deny that we're all benefiting of these huge advantages. But there's also a general feeling that big corporations are mining our data for purposes that are not necessarily in our own interests. Also, maybe governments and other types of organisations might be using our data to manipulate and to control us in certain ways which we mightn't be very comfortable with. The media loves these kind of stories of big public data leaks and so-called big evil corporations having knowledge of our personal lives, and this kind of fuels this fire. So, for example, a story in the New York Times was talking about Target, the big online or the big US retail company. There was a story that a father went to a Target store in his town of Minneapolis, demanded to speak to the manager, and was outraged to say that how come his daughter, who was in high school, was receiving all these coupons for products associated with maternity and babies. And, this was terrible because they were encouraging her, to go down that route. The company then rang him back a couple of weeks later and apparently to apologise. But apparently he had to apologise to the manager to say, well, listen, I actually went home and I found out a truth in the family that my daughter was actually pregnant. So it was this kind of scary story that Target actually realised through data analytics of the kind of product she was buying that she was pregnant before her very own family did. So there's these kind of scary stories. However, There's another more subtle reason, I think, that may also be contributing to our unease with big data and the potential insights that can come from it, which is it's far less commonly discussed. So as data and insights from this kind of data become more prevalent in our own lives, we're frequently confronted with facts which mightn't necessarily fit in to our own views of the world, or indeed our own views of ourselves. So we have to continually then reconcile these facts and truths about ourselves that the data is telling us, and we can't really deny these, with how we would like to see ourselves, how we think of ourselves. So just to give a couple of examples, so I might like to imagine that I listen to a very diverse and eclectic mix of music, because this fits in with the way I like to think of myself as open-minded and individualistic. But however, if you actually went to analyse, if I went to analyse my plays on my online music library, my listening habits, most of the time I might be just choosing to listen to Taylor Swift. So this is apparently a common phenomenon where a number of analyses of online music listening behaviour has shown that what people say they listen to and what they actually listen to are very different things. Another example might be that I like to imagine myself as a very fit and active person. I buy the latest Nikes to portray this image to other people and also to reinforce it in myself. However, there's a lot of activity trackers on the market now and apps for your phone which actually measure your actual activity, how many footsteps you take and what kind of activities you do. And this might tell me that, well, I'm actually below average in my activity levels. And there's been a lot of studies that show that people tend to overestimate the amount of activity and exercise that they actually do. So with both these scenarios, we have to reconcile what the data is telling us with the image that we would prefer to have of ourselves. And of course we can't argue with the data because it is fact. So as a collection and analysis of data becomes more widespread and common in our everyday lives, we more and more frequently have to reconcile these facts against what we prefer or otherwise would like to choose to believe. So there's less and less situations then when we can choose to believe what we would like to believe, so to kind of creatively fill in the gaps around these sparse hard facts in our lives. So resolving these observations and objective facts with our own internal beliefs, of course, is nothing new, and it's kind of fundamental to how humans understand and interpret the world. So, just think of the challenges science has brought to religious beliefs. Galileo, he wasn't too popular with the church, for example, for his beliefs and his scientific findings. And we're used to, I suppose, having this space around the facts in our everyday lives when we can make these assumptions and believe what we would like to believe to fit in with our own chosen views and aspirations. However, data and experiences are recorded in our everyday lives in more and more detail. And they're in a digital form, so they cannot be altered. They're never forgotten. They can be recalled instantly, and we can't interpret them necessarily in a huge range of different ways that you would with a more subjective memory of events. So how will this affect how we think and how we interpret the world and how we kind of see ourselves? So also big data can be aggregated over many people. So we're in this situation where we're continually being compared to other people and rated against what other people do. How do we fit in with that? So there's some research from psychology and neuroscience that shows that emotion plays a large part in human decision making. And Brian mentioned this point earlier, that humans are quite bad at making decisions from a rational point of view. So this emotional influence is much more strong than logic in many cases. So when we have these huge amounts of data to support our everyday decision making, how does this emotional side, which we are used to, how does that fit in? And how we adapt to making more and more of our decisions purely based on fact? A natural reaction then to being presented with facts that contradict our beliefs is often that we feel threatened, we mistrust and dispute the facts, and we might resent the source of this information. So is this a fundamental reason underlying some of the fear and suspicion behind the big data revolution and increased data-driven insights and decisions in our lives? So our chosen beliefs can be continually contradicted and threatened, and we all the time have to take this on board and accept this. Maybe we find it more comfortable to live in a world where there's ample space to make vague assumptions and to be creative with our versions of reality and our outlooks that we have ourselves. And maybe this is the world that we're more used to living in. So I like to believe that I listen to a diverse and eclectic range of music, and that I'm more active and healthier than average. Thanks.
Thanks, Oisin. Yeah, that raises very important questions about privacy and what data might tell us about ourselves. So good. Martin, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, well, I first of all want to sort of respond to Oisin and Brian by saying basically I want to defend my ability to make bad decisions, even without facts, based on morality or my own sort of false understanding of who I am. I think that should be my right, and that's kind of one of my sort of stances about data and the whole sort of world we're looking at about big data and being very factually based about the world. That doesn't make my life as complete as you'd think, actually. I do want to be more emotional, perhaps, about some decisions. I think that's one of the qualities about being a human that makes us really distinct. However, I've got a few things. I'm going to probably talk quite quickly because the time is short. I've already started to talk about other things. But, yes, data is everywhere. And, we've got a combination of things like transparency, science, data science, and also, this kind of real call for openness. So governments and institutions and companies, like has already been said, are using this stuff to kind of a lot of people's benefit, there's no doubt. But I'd like to use a quick analogy, it's got to be quick, to take, like, say, Formula One, right? When cars run around the track, they're collecting huge amounts of data, telemetry, about driver, steering wheel movements, engine performance, all that sort of stuff. And I think it's quite fascinating that, to be a bit of a caricature sort of analysis, is that all that data, all that immense amount of technology and science amounts to very, very minuscule improvements in performance. Each car can only get, a thousandth of a tenth of a second faster, even though they're collecting so much stuff. I don't think that's particularly paradoxical, because I think that if we think about big data in the world we live in, it's actually often used in a world where there's a very zero-sum sort of game sort of scenario, where less so we're using big data, I think, to look at new ideas, to challenge thinking. It's often used to kind of shore up businesses, organisations, viewpoints, especially in very tightly regulated kind of markets, if you like say Formula One racing, to eke out a small margin, right? Because effectively, I think big data in a lot of these instances are telling us things we already know about, but we're trying to kind of crunch the numbers to try and reveal an incremental, smaller, better fact. That's how it is, and I'm not against it. I'm just sort of stating how I understand it. But I think when it comes to searching out bigger, different ways of thinking, I don't think it's particularly always in our favour. There's a book by Nate Silver, who wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise: The Art of Science and Prediction. It's quite a good read. It's big, lots of different scenarios about how prediction is both correct and sometimes wrong. He wrote a little section about Donald Rumsfeld's very famous statement about the unknown unknowns in response to what happened with 9/11. Why didn't we see those attacks coming? And I think that what that book and Rumsfeld were kind of getting at was that the mistake they made trying to predict those attacks, those huge bombings, was that what they were doing is they're looking at the existing kind of data set as a predictor, as a correlator to something else would happen in a very likely way. And of course, what happened with those bombings, they did something completely different. And what the kind of the moral of that story is, in retrospect, is we need to look at the unknown unknowns. We need to start to answer and look at problems in a far bigger, deeper way than perhaps relying on our existing data to tell us what's going to happen next. Because unfortunately, the world is far more complicated, and of course, you and me are very hard to predict as well. So data is important, and disease. Science has uncovered, lots of kind of fantastic innovations have been uncovered by correlation. But equally, if you want to use big data to search for bigger ideas, bigger innovation, I'm not so sure that it's the right way to do it. That's my first sort of thing. Secondly, again, trying to cram this into a few short minutes, it is true that lots of companies have been, collecting data, all over the shop for a long time. Even McKinsey said in 2011 it's going to transform the world around us. It is going to produce these big insights, innovations. But actually, last month, McKinsey have now come out and said, you know what? 60% of those companies who are collecting that data just have no idea what they're doing with it, right? No idea whatsoever. Collect, collect, collect. It's kind of this sort of compulsion to use all these digital tools like you've been talking about, and let's use it to collect. And it gets them into trouble. One sense, because the reason why they're collecting is because it's for kind of cultural, political, economic reasons. It's about transparency. It's about being evidence-based. It's about trying to engineer more trust between you and me. It's about trying to open up their data so that you and me can kind of do more things with it. However, that's one aspect of this, which is kind of driving that sort of, kind of growth of data. But again, equally, the growth of not knowing what to do with it. But I think there's something else going on here, which I think is even more pernicious and difficult to deal with. Because I think that, more generally, I think we live in a culture where people, you and me, are probably more than ever in history under greater surveillance in terms of what we do. Not just by the state in terms of tapping our telecommunications. To be honest with you, they've been doing that for quite some time, not just since NSA and Snowden, but equally about us as people in terms of our behaviour, our good behaviour. So, for example, we have many stories now in the news, daily about how unhealthy we are, how we're making bad moral decisions about our health, our future, even on behalf of our kids, for example, about what we eat and what we stuff down our throats. I think that there is a real sort of tendency now with, say, government and lots of other organisations and companies, as I'll now argue, who are wanting to meddle more so in our lives to perhaps sometimes help us make better decisions, as Oseen has argued, because we are incapable, we're too emotional about understanding what's good for us, literally in terms of what we stuff down our throats. And I think it's in this kind of context where people are now more open to be kind of moved and barged around and told what to do, that big data has this kind of more pernicious, difficult aspect to it as well. Because what people are doing, what companies are doing more so, is using this propensity to collect data and then using it to perhaps change our behaviour, to change what we do, how we live our lives. And one example of this, or maybe a couple of examples of this, and I think it's a growing trend, this is my kind of thesis here, is that more companies and government departments and policymakers are kind of using big data around the whole idea of behaviour change, nudge. And that's where it's problematic, because what that's effectively doing is taking away our decision to live our lives as we choose, whether to make good or bad decisions, it's up to us. And rather than making these decisions through big data they're collecting, about developing, for example, new products and services that they think, sometimes quite rightly, will make our lives better. So a couple of examples, I'll be really quick. Apple, everyone's kind of, well, my now love-hate kind of organisation. I'm not a particular fan anymore. Got to be quick. New smartwatch, right? It's actually doing some quite incredible things in terms of research. It's actually collecting huge amounts of data now on behalf of medical companies, for example, tackling things like diabetes, blood pressure, all sorts of stuff. It's quite incredible because now they've got a device that can start sending that data to all these companies and organisations. It's going to have a great, tremendous effect. However, at the same time of doing that, Tim Cook, the CEO, basically said, you know what? Sitting is the new cancer. He literally said that. We are a world of unhealthy people. And actually, you want people like me, Apple, and other technology companies to help improve your lives, to change your behaviour. Every 30 minutes you use that watch, what does it do? It buzzes you to tell you to sit up, stand up, to do something, to change your behaviour, to move, to be fit and active. Now the point is, I'm arguing about all this. I've got other examples to talk about later. I think there's a slippery slope going on here, right? So organisations have, if you like, carte blanche to collect, but also a deeper mandate now, because so many people, behaviouralists and psychologists and so on, think people are living unhealthy lives. They've now got more of a mandate to kind of use that ability to collect data to kind of go a bit further and change our behaviour. One final example, automotive, cars, bad reputation. They're now obsessed about being digital, of course with the threat of autonomous cars, but but also about how to connect cars up and, control them with your phones, all sorts of stuff. Ford, for example, and others are doing the same thing, are also going one step further than the slippery slope and saying, right, let's collect data, not just in terms of what people are doing, where they're going to, but also in terms of their driving behaviour, right? Let's give them a better passport, a driving passport, as Ford are coming up with, their test, that people can carry on with them to enable them to get a better car in the future or a cheaper insurance premium, right? So the point is that they are going one step further, and this is the real concern to me about using this data in ways that are not necessarily good for our kind of freedom or our liberty, but often they're kind of constructing products and services and all sorts of stuff that ultimately are taking away choice, our autonomy. And I think that's the real crux of my argument, that I've got nothing wrong with big data per se, but I think that the moral political climate where a lot of this stuff is being used right now is actually against individual freedom. And I think that's the real danger. And maybe we can talk about how we rally against it to try and stop it. And I think that that's the crux of my kind of argument right now. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Martin. And thanks for resisting my attempts to destroy the PA system as well during that.
Right.
There's a huge amount there to chew on from all three speakers. I think it resolves, though, hugely into questions on decision-making and autonomy and privacy. So I just want to try to tease out what it is that we've spoken a lot about what data is telling us and what it tells us about ourselves from what we do. But what is it that this is a general question, first of all. Anyone wants to answer it, please do. What is it that we are telling it, and what is it that we want it to tell us, if anything? Anybody? If there's any...
Maybe one thing that sort of related to that, but just tied in the Formula One point there was an interesting thing. So there was a Formula One race at the weekend, and I was just listening this morning on the way into an interview. So I think Lewis Hamilton won the race, and his teammate was Rosberg. And at the end of the race, Rosberg was unhappy because he thought Lewis Hamilton was going too slow on purpose, so that Rosberg would get stuck behind him, and then the next guy, Vettel, behind him, would be trying to pass out Rosberg, and Rosberg would have to block him the whole time. That would ruin his race, basically, and he wouldn't be able to pass out Lewis Hamilton on the back of it. So Rosberg was giving out a little bit, and he was being interviewed, and he's saying, have you asked Lewis, did he do that? And he said, no, I can't ask him to do that, but I'm going to go back now and look at the data, and the data will tell me whether he did it on purpose or not. And that was kind of a funny thing, just go back to the looking for those deep things that he was... I was almost dodging the question. The data will tell me the truth of whether he was doing this on purpose and getting me into trouble. But I think that if you go back to I suppose, why do we care about it? What is the data going to do for us? Why do we give us these things? And I think I agree with a lot of stuff that it is kind of there's two sides to it. It's kind of there's some good bits and some bad bits. I think going back to the decision making and changing decisions, I was making the point. In a lot of ways, none of this is new. One of the things I really like as an example of someone who's big in data is Florence Nightingale, who's a great example of Florence Nightingale was not just carrying the lamp and mopping people's brows, that she was a kind of pioneer of data-driven medicine and evidence-driven medicine. And one of the big things she did was hammering home, you have to wash your hands. And general, not just have to wash your hands, but just general the importance of keeping things clean. And the connection between disease and basically dirt in hospitals and dirt in homes. And she did an enormous amount of work to change that, and changed the way people behaved in a good way, essentially, to reduce a whole pile of different problems that we had at the time. So I think when you think about what does the data give back to us, there's lots of places where the data shows us things that says, if we change in this way, this good thing is going to happen. And I think Gushing touched on it, and Martin as well, that there is a transition that comes along, and a slight kind of good side of things like the Apple Watch, and they're certainly not there by a long way yet, but there is more potential for us to grab hold of the data ourselves. So we've kind of, I suppose, been to a huge amount in the place where it's big corporations who get the data, and it's the likes of Apple, they have all the data from your phone, but we're moving more and more into a place where we can grab hold of that. And there's lots of interesting moves around who owns the data and who things should belong to, and should you get access to everything. And I think that's where that kind of value of what are we going to get. There's some interesting things. I think Oisín's points are really interesting about the mirror that the data is going to hold up to ourselves. We mightn't like that very much, but where we get to grab hold of those bits that we want to help us, I suppose help us maybe change behaviours a little bit in ways that we see as beneficial to us. But I think you're definitely right that there is the danger of other people using that data to say, oh look, you need to do this and you need to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think, one thing is, it's good to be empowered. I think, that's there's nothing wrong with that. So, if you're a patient, we live in a world where the whole kind of idea of the quantified self, collecting stuff on your wrist, or even plugging into your sort of connection with your GP, is never necessarily a bad thing in a sense of just knowing what's going on. But then I think my problem with this is, in a sense, to challenge perhaps these two on the right a little bit, although they are far more intelligent than me, so I'm going to get back again my way, is that facts themselves are open to interpretation, right? That we can't just treat facts as a sort of a wholly given sort of statement of truth. It's not true. Facts exist in a context, a political maelstrom of all sorts of stuff around climate change, health, or whatever. So, even the fact that we have these facts, doesn't sort of mean that we can kind of leave them be, because actually they are, ultimately very politicised. So my favourite area, although I'm not an expert, but is sort of the notion of kind of healthcare. One day we're told that being fat is life-threatening, and the next day, some time later, it's actually not the case. There's a great story this week where if you have Alzheimer's, which is unfortunate enough, if you're obese, you're a lot less likely to get Alzheimer's, for example. The point I'm trying to make here is that there are lots and lots of contradictory facts emerging all the time, and actually, we can't take for what we're told as being, the end kind of conversation. And rather, the missing element to this is actually having the wherewithal to kind of make moral decisions based on those facts, right? And that's where we get into the kind of realm of politics and culture and arguing about how we want to live. And as I said earlier, I don't want to live my life by a succession of facts, because that would be ultimately quite boring, and it probably would tell me too many truths. And I might not like the look of where I'm going, thank you very much. And it doesn't leave too much for deliberation. So actually, we need to make sure that we put this kind of data, fact mining, whatever you want to call it, into a lot more context than perhaps we first kind of realise, because things change like we do.
Yeah, I think that's a real interesting point, and I think as well we kind of live in this time at the moment where a lot of these technologies and gathering all this data, it's really new, and it's not. We don't all understand it. No one does where it's going to lead us. So I think we're living in this time where everyone's kind of embracing all this stuff a lot more, and maybe we'll move into a kind of a next phase where we make choices much more about what kind of data that we're going to listen to about ourselves or about things. So we could sort of ignore some of the information that's out there and just put it aside and say, no, listen, we're not going to live with this big stream of facts and information coming at us, and that we're going to make some more decisions based on our intuition and emotional sides.
Are you getting all teary?
Well, I don't want to be a robot.
Actually, before we go to the floor, I just wanted to pick up on the other strand that kind of emerged a lot of what you were saying, particularly about the pregnant girl. And that is the question of privacy. What is happening to our view of privacy and how that is mediated by our view of ourselves and what we're telling big data. Is privacy just an old hat concept? Is it going to fundamentally change because of the slippery slope that you're talking about, or is there any? Do we just have to come up with a new approach to this idea, or thoughts? Anyone?
I'll start off by saying, the kind of one of the responses to what I'm arguing is I think we should, one thing, the first step for me is to kind of reclaim privacy in terms of having a space where we can be ourselves without being bossed around, told what to do, including in our homes in terms of how to smoke or what to eat, is the first step. I think the first step for me is to really argue for adult autonomy, which is especially around this kind of behaviour, nudging that's taking place as I see it so often. That we should kind of reject it. Actually, as I'm saying, we should reject the idea that we should be told what to do in terms of how to eat and how to live, and demand our own sort of ability to think, in these areas on our own 2 feet and make mistakes. That's an important way of actually growing up. It's an important way of learning how to be who you are, especially privately, by kind of deliberating. And of course, if you're not able to do that, if you've always been told what to do, being nudged, having your environment built around you to protect you from yourself, then how the hell are you going to become an adult and grow up? So I think that for me the first step would be to kind of tell the nudgers and their data friends to buzz off.
Anybody want to come back on that?
I think one interesting thing, I suppose one interesting thing about that point and then an interesting thing about privacy. So I think an interesting thing about that point about telling the data and the nudgers to buzz off is, but being exactly that, choosing the bits that you want and choosing the bits. These are the bits that I want to take care of. So I was having a conversation yesterday about what would you do if you won the lotto, and one of the things myself and my friend both agreed on, we both get a cook. So get a cook. Eating's important. I want to eat tasty, healthy food, but that's just not a decision I want to be involved in my life. I want dinners presented to me every day. I don't care about it. I like food. That's something I want to take on board. And I think there's lots of places like that. That's an interesting example. There's a data role there somehow to say, there's lots of places, and to be empowered and say, these are the things I care about. These are the things that I want to spend my time thinking about and getting involved in. And there's these other things, I have to do these in my world, but I just don't care about them. I think self-driving cars is another one. I have this argument with my brother. My brother loves driving and is appalled at the notion of self-driving cars, whereas I just like to sit in the back, I can read, I can look around. It's great. I don't like driving anyway. So self-driving cars would be great, and being able to choose those things, and data can do some of these interesting things for us. I think a thing about privacy that I always find interesting is, so people talk about things like Facebook and how Facebook is the death of privacy, and I think there's some really good examples of the opposite of that. So I find, if I look at my friends on Facebook, that in some ways it's incredibly private because they present these fabulous versions of themselves. That I'm looking at them and I go, that's not the person I know. Look at them, they're constantly having these amazing holidays and these amazing parties, and they leave out all these other big chunks of their lives. So in a lot of ways, even though they're sharing all this information, they're still being incredibly private because they're choosing, in the opposite of the data kind of showing us back this mirror of here's who you really are, they're kind of building this version of themselves that they're going to push out and share with the world. And I think Facebook is just interesting because it always kind of comes up as, privacy is dead because everything's going on Facebook. But you look at all these examples where people are being incredibly private, but still putting lots of material up there. I think that's just interesting. I don't really know what that gives us an answer to. But
I'm interested to come back to the idea of the self, actually. I'm also interested to ask, will you pay the cook?
If I had won the lotto, I would have.
The job's going. I can rustle up a good pasta sauce. So. Okay, so we have a roving mic, which we'll be able to hear you if you have questions, but it's just for the sake of the recording, because we're recording it for a podcast, and we're also filming it. So God knows what's going to happen to it. Some sinister big data person might get their hands on it. So if anybody has any questions, points, comments, what we'll do is we just take a couple. We won't just do rat-a-tat one. We'll take a couple, bring the panel back in, and so on. So who's got the roving mic? Actually, oh, you have. Yeah. I think in order to be heard electronically as well as the other way is if you actually press the button at the bottom of it. Okay, Grandy. I think it has to be held. I'm not sure. Well, speak into it and see anyway.
I was interested in. Is that okay?
That's better. Yeah.
So I was interested in throughout the discussion in how you use some of the words like data and fact. And we seem to talk about what the data can do and what the facts can do as if they were active agents. And the question that you asked at the end of the initial round of discussions, I think, was really useful in this context, because you're asking about what we tell the data. And that, I think, really highlights the fact that all of the models we have that we're using, at least for prediction, they're not theory-free. And a lot of the times, I think Martin highlighted the fact that they can be used to reinforce, particular viewpoints, particular biases. And one of the problems here is that sometimes somebody can have a perspective that they want to enforce. And they say, right, what I'll do is I'll make a model based on data, and then I'll tell people that you can't fight the data. And really the model is just encoding my own views, because I'm choosing what data to use and finding the data that gives me the correlations I need. And that's, so I think there's a lot of benefits of big data, but we have to work on, and why this type of a forum is so useful is, we have to work on our understanding and our education more generally in the public, so that we can understand that we can engage in discussions and that we can actually argue against a fact.
Thank you. Anyone else there? Did I see another hand up? Okay, if anybody wants to come back on that point, actually, because that's a very good question.
It's kind of like what I was reading in that book by Nate Silver, because that's what he's kind of arguing, that a lot of the kind of predictions, correlations, and dare I say, the science of data analytics is very, political. That's what I'm trying to think of. So the examples he's using is, for example, around climate change as well. There's obviously a growing consensus around that particular kind of data model, that projection, that correlation. But of course, over the last sort of 10, 15 years, for example, temperatures have not continually shot up. In fact, they've kind of leveled out, and it's kind of caused some consternation about how to kind of work that out. But because there's a kind of growing consensus around a particular way of predicting climate change and its sort of propensity to kind of get worse and so on, everyone's kind of grouped around the same kind of philosophy of understanding and way of using the data, and it's kind of borne out a very kind of clear political consensus. So if you dare challenge it, you're going to get into kind of quite a considerable kind of trouble and be castigated perhaps as being a skeptic or a cynic. So I kind of entirely agree with your point that even the kind of models and the predictions and the science is itself a very kind of political kind of process, and there's always more than one way to skin a cat. And I think that what he does in the book is, again, I'm no expert by any means, but he talks about kind of Bayesian sort of probability, where actually it's a way of kind of counteracting a given sort of notion of something when circumstances change, and you have to kind of recalculate the probability or risk of something happening again in the most likely kind of form. I agree with you. It's a very political kind of point.
Yeah, and analysis of data as well. I mean, it's hugely open to abuse, I think. So with your point there as well, that it depends who is presenting, who is using the data, I think, to present a certain view, and what their maybe reasons behind that is. So, I mean, even how data is visualized and graphed and so on can tell a completely different story, even using the exact same numbers, and you can present it in a certain way that makes it seem that an effect is bigger than what it might actually be, or what it might actually compare to if it was viewed another way. So I think, that's all part of, I think, something that as people get more accustomed and used to seeing data used in different ways and being used to tell different stories, it's something that people become more aware of when we are kind of being duped by just one point of view in some information.
I'm going to be very boring and agree with you as well. But I'm trying to remember, I was reading, and I'm trying to remember the details of it, an article where someone has done a recent study of this, where they took a data set and they had a question. I can't remember the details of the data set. They had a question to say, is there a relationship between this and this? So is something a predictor or something else? It might have been a health data set. but they sent it out to 20 different research groups. There's universities in the States, and he sent this data set out to 20 different research groups who were all statisticians, data analytics people, so people who should know how to do this, and said, here's the data, here's my question, right? Is there a relationship between this and this? And he got back, 11 said yes, 9 said no, I think. And the really interesting thing was when they delved into that, like you say, so we collect data. When we analyze data, that's where things get interesting, but that's not a passive process, so we make lots of decisions about what kind of analysis are we going to do, what kind of data, of the data, which bits are we going to use, which bits aren't we going to use. And it was just a really nice study around that, where all those groups, they generally knew what they were doing, or notionally knew what they were doing, but they all made different decisions about exactly how they do that analysis, and therefore lots of them came to different answers. And it was just a really nice illustration of exactly that. So nobody trying to fudge the data or anything like that, but data analysis it's an active thing, and there's a bit of an art to it, and the decisions that people make impacts the outcome in a big way. So like that, it's not cold and hard to say this is the truth.
That actually brings me on to a point that I wanted to make, and that was raised in the question as well. And it's just it's about the work that correlation is being made to do instead of causality. And I'd be interested to hear your reflections on whether or not hypothesis-driven science is not on the way out as such, but whether this is being worked against slightly, maybe.
Yeah.
And if that's a problem, or whether it's an issue.
So I think it's really interesting, and there's a lot of it around. So there's a lot of people that say the model is dead, and correlation is all that matters. The theory is dead, correlation is all that matters, and we find correlations, and that's that. Mm-hmm. But in a certain way, I suppose, going back to getting boring by saying nothing's new under the sun, a lot of it just is bad science in a lot of places. And go back to that point about, we get these new recommendations all the time. There's another article I was reading recently. Someone has done a good study looking at, how much of scientific publications that are meant to be very good, very rigorous, just how much of them turn out to be wrong. There was a nice study about, someone looked at the Lancet or something like this and just went through 20 years worth of stuff, how many of these studies turned out to follow through and got replicated, and it's a tiny fraction of them turn out to be that way. And a lot of that just comes back to people not doing things, I suppose, as well as they should. And some of that, I think, one of the interesting things is that idea of finding correlations and putting the story around that. So all the data tells you is, this matches with this. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? And there's a really nice other example of it's one of the famous examples of where those correlations went wrong. There was an article published in Nature where someone found a correlation between children having nightlights and turning out to be short-sighted in later life. And basically, nightlights cause short-sightedness. Study published in Nature, so that should be really good. Turned out to be absolute nonsense. That basically people who are short-sighted, parents who are short-sighted, have bad night vision, so tend to put nightlights in their children's bedrooms, and short-sightedness is hereditary. So there was no link there at all, but there was great stuff in the paper saying, plug out your nightlights straight away. And even these places where these people are meant to be really good at this, we find those things. So I think there's a really interesting, in that shift, like you say, to kind of just science being driven by correlations, there's a layer of, that's not new, and we still should be doing these rigorous kind of things to try and understand actually what causes these things. But I think where it is really interesting is you do see in things like drug discovery, where that has become just a data-driven thing, and it does match that data-driven idea that you say we're just going to test a load of things and find the things that match up, and we don't care why this works the way it is. We're just going to test and test and test until we find the combination that has the effect that we want it to have. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really interesting end of it, where that focus on correlation seems to really work. And that's kind of interesting.
But don't you think, and I don't want this to sound too cruel, if you like, but don't you think that we're also right now in a time with sort of politics and policy where, if you like, everything seems to have an answer in science. Everything seems to have an answer in data, psychology, behavioralism, never a sort of decisions made now without a sort of scientist sort of kind of giving some kind of correlated response to say, well, X and Y is happening because of these factors. Is that always a good thing? Because to me, it's not quite right. It seems to me that what's happening right now is we're sort of deferring authority, decision making, if you like, to scientists. No bad thing. You're clever, but does science always have the right answers to social, political, moral problems? If you see what I mean.
Is this prior to big data in a way? This, if you like, abnegation or retreat from politics and responsibility. I mean, in some ways, and this is why I asked a question at the start about what we tell big data, is that certain things and assumptions were already in place about what big data could do, and based a lot on what had already, if you like, a deterioration of politics and that sort of sphere.
Yeah, I mean, because I work in business with organisations who are collecting all this big data, and the sort of skeptic in me says, well, the reason why they're doing that is because they don't want to make decisions. They're sort of, again, deferring their sort of authority to this stuff. And it's perhaps, as I described earlier, it's often those decisions are fairly kind of small scale. So when it is, what do we do? Well, we need to look at our customers. We can refer to the data rather than having to kind of come up with groundbreaking, radical innovation. It really fits the model.
Yeah.
So to me, it's no bad thing about data, but it just seems to me it really fits with the kind of cultural moment, shall we say, that we go to the data first, rather than our kind of intuition to make a bold statement or decision.
Mm-hmm. Because in a way that dovetails with what you were saying as well about what we have, the selections we make being recast to us or given back to us as a set of behavioural circumstances, if you like, a set of kind of behaviours, and that tells us something that we didn't know. Are we? Do we risk losing something in that transaction, if you like, in that interaction rather? Is our subjectivity being lost somewhere along the way? Because in a way it comes to what you're saying about slippery slope, but I'm just wondering, because again it comes back to what we are telling.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a lot of questions as well that just can't be answered. And one of the things with big data is often this expectation that all our questions can be answered if we could just find the right data and analyse it in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of ignoring the fact that maybe there's a lot of these questions that the data can't answer and won't ever be able to answer because they don't come from things that are like factual. That's a hard word to use, I suppose now, but that aren't represented in the data, and they have to come from, as you say, our kind of human innovation and creativity.
Any questions at all? Yeah, sorry, a few. Fire away.
I just want to bring it back to, you were talking about the parole, you were saying the data, they were using the data to analyse to see if people should go on parole. One of the interesting things about that is if you think about the buy-in of the actual, say the institute who's doing this, if they think of it on a very basic level, that they're going to trust this system and yes, it's going to work out. But if you think about all of the other kind of little variables that you can slip in, so they might have, say, correctly be able to kind of categorise, say, 95%. But if you think about, say, there was another 5% who was doing something like maybe a religious experience was another random variable that was thrown in. Maybe a prisoner suddenly decided he changed his ways. The model would have classified and said, yes, you're going to re-offend, you're not up for parole. But if you think about, if you didn't fully buy into the system and you said, well, we'll always take that 5% extra and we'll say, what if? And then if you step away from all of your data and say, well, actually, this person is a good candidate for it, but the data happened to be wrong in this case because we just didn't happen to consider all of these other variables that we could have put into it. Now, it starts bringing us back to how much do we buy into this? And if you think about other things like you were saying about the correlations And say like some of the good correlations that are out there at the minute, say like smoking causes cancer, asbestos causes cancer, but then there in the last say 5 or 10 years, it's been slowly escalating, and the more kind of research is going into it, suddenly sitting causes cancer, talking causes cancer, and just generally being alive is going to cause cancer. And on a long, as someone once said, on a long enough time scale, everyone's survival rate drops to 0, which is true. So it makes you think that at the day, like no matter how much we can really put into this, at the end of the day, we're not going to account for every religious experience, every correlation that we can possibly imagine. And it kind of further pushes that. And will we ever really get to that point where we fully have a grasp on it?
Thank you. Here at the front.
Yeah, I'm from the Institute of Ideas in London. I'd like to wish Justin and Brett and everybody good luck with the salon.
Thanks, Jeff.
And just on the discussion, I thought your analogy about Rosberg and Hamilton at the beginning, I really like that, because Rosberg is saying, I've got to look at the data, I've got to find out what the problem is. Whereas the rest of the world knows that the problem is that Hamilton has got his number and he doesn't know what to do about it. I don't know what he should do about it, because Hamilton's better than him.
Yeah.
But it's an existential human problem. He's got to make himself go faster. The data make him solve it, but it won't solve the problem. So
True.
I thought that was a good analogy. Just to say, I'm a member of what's called Biobank in England, which is hundreds of thousands of people. It's run by the Wellcome Trust and other people, and it's a long-term study to improve health, public health, and whatever. And to me, I have to wear a bracelet every now and again, fill in various questionnaires. To me, that's a very good initiative, and hopefully it'll help to, health, public health in the future. So all those things are good, but on the other side, what I thought Ushin was saying at the beginning, and probably not, it's the idea that we have to re-educate ourselves around the data. That's what's more alarming. So I might drink too much, not that I do, or eat things that are not healthy, or sit too much, which I'm sure I do, but the data might tell me that all those things are wrong, or I should do all those things differently, but I need to decide, or I have to have the freedom to decide, which at the moment you generally do, although this nudging thing is alarming. But I think at the end of the day, it has to be ourselves as a society, as groups of people, whoever we are, who can use the data for our own benefit and to do positive things. Where either consciously or unconsciously you're told you have to do this because of this, against your will, then that's a whole different matter. So there are dilemmas, and obviously data can be good things, and it is used as a substitute for many other things that's a problem. So it's just getting the balance on many of those things.
Thank you. Anybody else? Just pass it along there. Thanks.
Is it on?
I think you might have to press it at the bottom, but
You can let go once it's on.
Right.
oh yeah, you can. Sorry, I think I had to keep it held. Sorry.
I'm going to be a scaremonger, an old person type person, and say, what about young people? Because while we're talking about these decision-making processes and how we're deferring to systems and analytical means of understanding our behaviour, I'm considerably older than some other people who are using these systems as well. And while some of them are just fun things like Facebook, how long would I survive in a zombie apocalypse, where they ask you a set of questions based on your personality, whatever. There's other more troubling things that I find in I assume the men's toilets as well, but in the ladies' toilets in Trinity College Dublin. There's posters of, obviously a survey is being run by the college, and it's an online survey directed, it seems to me to be at young women, asking them if they feel that they're in a good relationship or an abusive one, and that if they go online and click these series of questions, they can find out by assessing their partner's characteristics whether he's a potential abuser or victimizer. To me, this is troubling and I suppose I don't have to explain why it's troubling, but I think the focus on decision making in terms of being fully formed adults, and so also we seem to be talking a lot about health here, and I want to talk about the emotional life decisions, and particularly of younger people who have relied more on computers than anybody who was born in the 70s or the 60s or whatever. It's like a form of horoscope or wise sage, but it has this analytical, factual database behind it, which I think is very disempowering and also very frightening because of the way it frames. It's either this or this. You've either got a loving partner who'll always be there for you, or a potential abuser, as opposed to a much more complex situation between two people. And I think that's important in terms of what you were saying about sort of the dice is loaded, or it's all kind of preempted by the very question that it asks. And I think that's why when you said, what do we tell big data, what do we ask of it?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably even more important than what we do with it when we have it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was just...
Thank you.
Yeah, I just kind of want to reiterate and agree with that. I think just listening, it's kind of a common thought that you can't use big data on its own. I think there's a layer that humans will add, and it's the why and the why is this true, and what does this actually mean. Just another example of some data that was drawn from online dating sites in and around Valentine's Day, and it seemed to indicate there was loads of men and loads of traffic driving to sites. So, that would suggest what the correlation would be that, men are unhappy and are looking for somebody else. Whereas when people actually, dug a little deeper into it, men were actually just trying to find out what women wanted so they could please their partners. So I just think there is a real danger if we leave big data in isolation up to the decision making, like you were saying in the judicial system, that it's quite dangerous, and there always needs to be that human element at play, and it's that kind of balance, and I think the sweet spot was the term that was used earlier as well.
Thank you. Anybody else? Those are great contributions, so obviously you're not going to be able to answer all of them, but please, Brian, probably back to you to start with.
So I think there are a couple of points there that are touching around the same thing. So I think a lot of the particularly predictive models and things come back to that idea of correlation. I suppose one of the things I was trying to make is just the point of how blunt it is. It's good, does good stuff. It's the best we could do to a certain extent, but it is a blunt instrument. And again, this idea of hidden features is really interesting to go back. So we build the models, we choose what goes in, and that has a huge impact. So we always talk, when we're particularly with predictive models, about this idea of hidden features, so the things you haven't captured in the data, so therefore your model isn't taking any account of. So I think go back to the point that was made about, well, the model says this about parole, but it hasn't taken into account these different experiences that people had. That's a problem that we constantly face, and goes back to the idea that data isn't doing anything by itself. We're asking it questions, we're choosing the questions that we ask, and then we're building these models that the predictions come out of. And that is very limited. And I think a really important thing is to understand where are the limits and where that works. And I think the point about the people being told by the system, your partner is going to beat you up someday, that's a bit terrifying, because people are going to go, well, this system must know. And it's probably a pretty bad prediction model that it has in there that's making that prediction and isn't taking into account all the nuance and all those interesting things.
It's up with posters about, unwanted pregnancies, and
Yeah.
so health matters as though it is something similar.
Exactly, and I think that's going back to those. And then I think an overarching thing with the whole thing is that if we're going to use the results of these sorts of analysis, being able to interpret it and being able to find the blend of, okay, the system says this, but here's my layer of nuance and things that I know on top of that. I think though there is some of the discussion, one thing that was interesting, some of the discussion I think is getting mixed up a little bit. So we talked about some of the science things between, mixing that up with data and science, and I think one of the problems is there's an issue around expertise, and this being able to say, oh, we're not going to go back to we're not going to respect the experts in a sense, and the scientists are telling us you should do this, and we're saying no, we want the freedom to do it. And I think data gets kind of jumbled up with that, and I think it's a different thing. But I think a good example, kind of talking against that, and kind of I'm going to fight for the scientists on this one, and that idea of making sure that we maintain respect for expertise is, say, the vaccine or the anti-vaccination thing that's going on in the States at the minute, where people are saying you shouldn't vaccinate children. They're just wrong. So science, you can draw a hard line there and just say those people are wrong and science is right, and people are making terrible decisions just based on things that people who are uninformed and wrong.
Although, ironically, that was something that at root originated from the medical community and initially had the full endorsement of governments and the media at the time before it was widely discredited. So there is. Yeah, I know. I take your point. And of course, what you're saying as well, I think, has a bearing on the question about parole and the decisions that were used in that case. Oisin?
Yeah, well, I think like data analytics and these kind of this influence in our everyday lives and these kind of models that make predictions for us. It's still relatively new. We haven't been kind of used to using this and to seeing these outcomes for a huge amount of time. So I kind of have faith that these sort of naive and simple approaches, which really don't work like that, the concerns around that survey on the poster, which is very simplified and you can easily see problems with that hopefully that through experience these will be borne out, that people will realise that this isn't the way to go and these kind of things will be ignored and people will come to understand that there's problems with these kind of things, and that will be borne out through experience, because I think now it's a new thing in our lives and we're kind of embracing all this thing that's out at the moment without really taking stock of what the benefit is going to be to us.
Thanks.
Yeah, just a few things. So kind of reiterate what Jeff down the front said, in the sense that there are many instances where data and kind of machine learning, even sort of pseudo artificial intelligence, shall we say, can be really good for us. Actually, it can sort of kind of take over the mundane chores, make sort of repetitive sort of decision making for us a lot more easier, where it's beyond the realm of kind of human cognition to do that stuff at speed and so on. So I'd kind of like to somewhat defend big data in some ways, actually. It has got a great help, especially around sort of medical science and all that sort of stuff. But I think also the other thing about kind of kids and the young and the effect that it might have, kind of working with using technology. I think for me it can be kind of a problem because they are somewhat open to kind of reveal too much about themselves online in terms of their sort of social forums and networks and so on, and they don't really get a sense of privacy as I understand it. And I think that there is a certain amount of growing up that kids and even adults my age have to kind of do now, in terms of how we perhaps communicate with one another using social networks, because there is that trade-off. Because we give away so much data, it's inevitable that we're also going to be sort of invaded in our sort of private lives as well, because that's the kind of the culture we're living in right now, where technology companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, what's his name, Zuckerberg has sort of said a while back, privacy, so what? And that is the world we're living in right now. So I think that yes, it's partly our sort of, shall we say, our kind of moral responsibility to make sure that kids using this stuff are more self-aware, because it can obviously in a few years' time sort of lead to perhaps some embarrassing kind of situations where you've said something, or a potential employer looks at your LinkedIn bio, or at least what you're saying on Facebook, and says, actually, I don't like the look of you anymore because you are a bit of a crazy party animal. So I think, yes, what we have to do is grow up, actually, and be more protective of ourselves. A bit like what you said actually earlier, about actually, it is true we create different kind of personas online and Facebook. I think people do that, but we probably need to be more diligent about what we say about ourselves. God help us, especially on Twitter, because of course with the clampdowns on free speech, getting jailed for jokes, it's pretty dangerous out there actually sometimes. So yeah, we need to grow up a bit.
Thank you. I'm tempted to go for kind of a 30-second summing up. Well, not 30 seconds, a minute, let's say, summing up based on everything that we've heard, especially from the floor, why not do it in the order that we started? If you had to sum up your concerns, hopes, whatever, for
Yeah.
big data in 1 minute.
So I think the thing that has come up again and again is that we have this advantage, and technology has given us that we can collect all this data now. So we've got nice sensors, we've got all this stuff, we can collect all this stuff, it's easy. That didn't happen before. And I think the interesting thing that opens doors say, oh, we can do things with that. So we can build predictive models and we can build these systems that help us. And I think like Oisin said, actually, we're kind of to a certain extent at the beginning of that and figuring out how to do it. And a really important thing that's come up again and again is to put those systems kind of at the right level. And there's a certain amount of understanding, they're not that great. When you open up the box, there's not that much going on inside there. So to make sure that when we get kind of results out of these and we get recommendations and predictions from those, that we interpret those with all the limitations and all the assumptions and all the things that went into that. There's a nice little example. I know people who worked in a lot of people who worked in banks during the financial crisis and all that, and these are the people saying they were doing a good job and it wasn't their fault. And one of the things that comes up again and again is they were all building these forecast models saying, this is going to be the default rate. And one thing that happened again and again and again is they build the model. They'd say, the model says the default rate is going to be 10%, given unemployment is going to be this, and inflation is going to be this, and a huge range of assumptions. And what would happen is when that figure went to the next step in the chain, they all fell away, and it's the default rate is going to be 10%. The model said that's going to be the truth. And I think that's a place where it's really interesting for us to go, that if we're going to use these systems, that more and more of us realize, these aren't that great. There's all these assumptions, all these limitations, and so we have to interpret the answers that we're getting with that nuance and all that sophistication.
Thanks,
That's where I
Brian.
go.
Thanks, Brian. Oisin?
Well, I like to be an optimist, and I suppose with all new kind of sciences and new innovations and new technologies that come out, I suppose, in the beginning, there's a lot of mistakes made, and they're used for purposes which, mightn't be in people's best interests, and some of the concerns around nudges and how the data is interpreted and used for, and us believing, truths in the data are actually the truths, but there's different ways to interpret them and so on. I'm thinking that, as data analytics becomes more well known and people are more comfortable with it, and it's been around for a bit longer and people understand it more, I think a lot of these issues hopefully will kind of iron themselves out, because through time people will know and begin to understand what's good about it, what's bad about it, and it will be the beneficial parts will remain, and the kind of less beneficial and parts where it can be abused, hopefully people won't continue with that.
Thanks, Oisin.
My sort of reading of this and the discussion is, I think it just feels like to me that this is big data is like a solution looking for a problem. That's what's kind of worries me about it, because I think that, as I sort of quoted earlier, McKinsey and all those other kind of management consultants who celebrate it are now saying actually 60% of people don't know what the hell to do with it. That's where it becomes a real problem to me, because we've got people that are sort of looking to say, right, how do we actually apply this? What can we do with this stuff? And to whose agenda can we sort of make a case for in terms of all this stuff we've been collecting for the last God knows how many years in these data centres all around the world. I think that's where it gets a bit problematic to me, because I think that, for me, you've got to get to grips with why they're doing this in the first place. And it's kind of this sort of, moral, political problem about, trying to engender greater sense of transparency and trust. And sometimes that's successful, but sometimes it's going to get them into even more of a pickle. Especially when, I would argue there's such a prevalence around this idea of nudging people about using this stuff, which often is against our interests. It's about taking away our choices. So when you've got this sort of idea of a solution looking for problems, I see it, that's when it becomes slightly dangerous, because you start applying it in all kinds of areas that perhaps in ways you'd never really originally intended it to be used for. And who knows, is that kind of an argument that came, talked about earlier, the sort of slippery slope, and that's where it gets dangerous for me, because, what might have originally been a very goodwill reason for collecting stuff around about you and me in terms of our health and fitness, the examples around, say, the Wellcome Trust and so on, could quite easily be turned against us. Typically the police are brilliant at doing that in terms of collecting data around, people's propensity for, how they live their lives or whatever, and then we can kind of make different correlations about actually different kind of sections of community, and lo and behold, those kind of policies can be used against us in some way or other. So I think it can be slightly dangerous if we don't sort of keep it in check. And I think, finally for me, the question is more broadly, can it also help us, come up with big ideas, big innovations, radical thinking? Because often, when it does come to things like, healthcare, drug development, or even other areas like transport, perhaps relying too much on the data we're already sort of aware of can kind of work against us in terms of, when we probably are more needy of more radical thinking perhaps about how we can move forward and be more ambitious with ourselves. So that's my, I guess, note of caution. So there you go.
Thank you. Can we thank our panel, please? So thank you all for coming and for your contributions. It made for a very stimulating discussion. I want to announce our next session, actually a couple of announcements. Our next session, our next debate, is going to take place on Wednesday, July the 1st. Assisted suicide should be legalised. That's going to be a slightly different format. It's going to be a two-header, if you like. We have Jackie Davis, who's the chair of healthcare professionals for assisted dying in the UK. So you know what she's going to be saying, or the position she's going to be arguing. And Kevin Newell, a historian and author of Assisted Suicide, the Liberal Case Against Assisted Dying. So that's on Wednesday, July the 1st, more than likely in this room. The details will be going up on the website in due course. We have the list to pass around for people to sign. Oh, it's already...
Yeah, most people have, but I'll just leave it at the door
Oh,
here.
great,
If you'd
okay,
like to
brilliant,
join
yeah.
the mailing list and you haven't signed already.
Oh, great, thank you. I wanted to say a word of thanks, especially to Neil and Carl here at CCT for letting us use the venue because it's such a central location. It's great, and when people are coming over from the UK, it's great that they can go somewhere very central. So, yeah, if we can just give them a round of applause, please. And we've gone over time, but not too badly. It's all right for the first time, I think. Yeah, so I only had to use that once. That's not bad. So yeah, thanks all for coming, and yeah, keep an eye on the website www.dublinsalon.org for future events. And yeah, thank you. Thanks, guys.